Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Susman. I am Shibley Professor of Biobehavioral Health here at Penn State, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Penelope Trickett, who is the David Lawrence Stein Violet Goldberg Sachs Professor of Mental Health in the School of Social Work and Professor of Psychology, University of Southern California in Los Angeles. For the last 30 years, she started her research when she was very young. Her research has focused on the developmental consequences of child abuse and neglect in children in childhood and adolescence, and on the characteristics of families in which the abuse occurs. She has been the recipient of many research grants from the National Institutes of Health, including an Independent Scientist Award from the National Institute of Mental Health. In addition, Dr. Trickett currently conducts 2 longitudinal studies. One, now in its 26th year, concerns the psychobiological impact of familial sexual abuse on girls. She will be talking about this study today. The second is a study of the impact of neglect, alone or in combination with other types of abuse, in young adolescents. Her research has received multiple awards, most recently the Society for Social Work Excellence in Research. Dr. Trickett also directs a new initiative in Los Angeles called the Child Development and Children's Services Cluster. The mission of this initiative involves working with community partners in efforts to prevent child abuse and to strengthen families. In addition to Dr. Trickett's academic research career, she has been involved in consulting with multiple protective service agencies. She has educated hundreds of undergraduates and graduate students on research related to child maltreatment. She consults with a number of different agencies, not just in the North America, but throughout the world. Dr. Trickett.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. So one research study that, as was just mentioned, started over 25 years ago that focuses on females who've been sexually abused by a family member. This study began in 1987. Frank Putnam, who's a child psychiatrist, and I were the joint PIs to begin with. We've had collaborators. If you look at the 4th one listed there, you'll see a name you're familiar with, Elizabeth Susman. So she's been collaborating with me on this from the start. John Horn and Jack McCardle were methodologists. Some of you know their work, who've been very helpful in the initial design of the study and various complicated analytic procedures we've used since. And Jenny Knoll came on as our project director when she got her Ph.D. and is now a co-PI. She's a very critical part of the study. And we've had many graduate students and research assistants that were very important. Okay. This was our original conceptual model, and I think it looks quite complicated. It's not as complicated as it looks, I don't think. On the left-hand side, we conceived of sexual abuse as a trauma, but as a trauma that could vary in degree, depending on the nature of the acts, the duration and frequency, the relationship to the abuser, whether there was physical force or threats or violence involved, and the age of onset of the abuse. We considered that this trauma would have acute responses that included both psychological distress and physiological stress. And then if you look all the way to the right, that these processes would influence development during adolescence, which is when we were looking, in terms of both competency, the development of competencies that are so important for adolescence, such as cognitive and social development and competence, self-esteem, sense of control, and also psychopathology. And the prior research in the area had suggested these 4 areas in particular to be of concern. And then in the middle, we figured that family and peer support would be an important mediator between the initial response and longer-term outcomes. We also, kind of down at the bottom, you see the confusion that we had. We were really interested in looking at the passage through puberty and how that might impact outcomes differentially for kids who've been sexually abused versus children in general. And the hormones of puberty are overlap in some ways with the hormones of stress, so that's why there's this sort of circular thing there. Okay. So the distinctive features of this study when we started was that it was longitudinal and prospective. There was essentially no such research for more than maybe a year or two at the time we started. There were acute impact studies of children recently disclosed sexual abuse and retrospective studies of adults. Other features were we were interested in familial abuse and family contexts, and that came from our background, mine in particular, I guess, where I I was interested in child development in the family, and then in particular in families, different kinds of families. So the first study I'd done prior to this was on physical abuse, and looking at it sort of from the how physical abuse related to domains of child rearing or parenting, and so brought that into this study. Also had an explicitly developmental framework where when we started studying the transition through puberty, and then as we continued this study, we looked at the transition to early adulthood. We had what you could call a whole child, or maybe we should call it a whole adolescent perspective. So we're interested not only in mental health, which at that time most of the research was on the deleterious mental health consequences of sexual abuse, but we were also interested in how this would affect normative competencies that were developed, education, the whole range of adolescent development. We also, from the start, had a psychobiological orientation and measures. And this was, Dr. Susman was very influential in getting this part into the study, for which I am forever grateful. So this was our original design, cross-sequential design, so that combined some cross-sectional and longitudinal elements. If the horizontal axis there is age, and the vertical is essentially real time. So we started, so the lower box that says time 1 means that we recruited kids from 6 to 16 years of age. Going up from 88 to 90 means it took that long to recruit them and see them for the first session that we saw them. And then the plan was to see them a year later and a year later. And we did that pretty well, it extended just a little bit. So at time 1, our sample was mean age 11, at time 2, a little over 12, and at time 3, close to 13 and a half. And then I always say that the blue in the middle is a funding gap. And then we got more funding and did time 4 and 5, where they were mean age 18, almost 20, and then another smaller funding gap did time 6 when they were about 25 years of age on average. And This is the retention rate from time 1 to any one of the 4, 5, or 6. Individually at 4, 5, and 6, we saw about 85 to 87%, and some people we saw one time, then not another. So overall, it's 96%, which has been great. And Jenny Knoll gets all the credit. She was amazing. Let's see. Okay. So here were our participants. The abuse group families came from protective service agencies in and around Washington, D.C., mostly around, in the counties in suburban Maryland, and then out from there, and suburban Virginia, and out from there. We had 10 different agencies. The eligibility criteria for inclusion in the study were females aged 6 to 16. Now, we did females for a couple of reasons. One was, the main one, I would say, was at that time, and it may still be true, protective service agencies, the disclosure of sexual abuse to protective service agencies was vastly female. So about 85% of the families coming in, the victim was female. And so just from a practical perspective, we knew this was going to be a very hard study to do and to recruit. To try to recruit similar numbers of males, we just didn't think it was possible. The other thing was that because of our interest in puberty and the timing of puberty being different for boys and girls, that again, it seemed we had to start somewhere, and so we started with females. Disclosure within 6 months of participation, and that means disclosure, official disclosure to Child Protective Services. We were interested in getting acute response cases. We knew it wouldn't make sense to try to recruit families at the moment of disclosure because so much was going on. So we thought 6 months would still be in the acute phase, but give families time to, get over the crisis in some degree. Sexual abuse involved genital contact and/or penetration, and the reason for this was that some of the prior studies that had been done would combine people who had been exposed once to pornography with people who had been violently raped for 10 years. And we just thought we wanted a definition that was a little more homogeneous, if you will, than that, but clearly sexual abuse. The perpetrator was a family member. So this is quite different from a lot of what we've been hearing already today. And so it was biological parent, step-parent, older sibling, grandfather, uncle, mother's live-in boyfriend. Again, the reason for this primarily was our interest in how development within the family proceeded or didn't proceed. We did not limit the gender of the perpetrators. Turns out we had one female and all the rest were male. And the female was the stepmother. And then we needed a non-abusing parent or guardian willing to participate, and this was, first of all, of course, because you need that when you have minors in your research. Secondly, we wanted someone to fill us in on the developmental history of the girls, et cetera. As it turned out, we found, we added a lot of measures, and these women, they were almost all women and almost all mothers who were actually the participants. Okay. So here is the characteristics of the sexual abuse in our sample. 70% had experienced some kind of penetration. These are averages, basically. The average age of onset was about 8 years of age. The average duration was over 2 years. The relationship to the perpetrator, now I told you we had a whole variety of familial perpetrators. We needed to collapse this for statistical analysis reasons. So we collapsed it into biological father, who was, so almost a quarter of our sample was abused by their biological father. Other father figure, and that combined stepfathers or mother's live-in boyfriend, that was 35%, and a little over 40%, it was other relative, which is quite a mixture of people. 50% basically had experienced physical violence, either associated with the sexual abuse or separate instances of physical abuse, either by this perpetrator or somebody else. And we had to sort of collapse that into this. And then what surprised me was over 40% of these girls had had a prior sexual abuse experience prior to the instance that got them into our study. Not necessarily by a family member, but I think in all cases another person than the perpetrator that got them into our study. Okay. Socioeconomic status was diverse, pretty much blue collar, upper lower SES. Race was diverse, about half Caucasian and half minority, almost all African American. And so this was in, as I said, the Washington, D.C. area, and it represented pretty well at least the people who were going into protective services at that time. We developed a comparison group that was very similar in race, SES, residential zip codes, in other words, they lived in the same neighborhoods, family constellation, and we didn't develop, but we checked on this, other kinds of stress, not over and above, not including sexual abuse. They were quite similar. This just relates to how we kept our sample, but the last one should be, if Jenny Knoll finds them, they will come. Here are a couple of our refrigerator magnets. So we sent birthday cards. We did all sorts of things to maintain contact, even when we didn't have any funding. Okay, so here's what I'm going to try to talk about in just a few minutes. It's kind of complicated. And I really want to get to the end, so hopefully I can. So I'll talk about, well, I'll just start talking. Okay. And before I do, when we started this study, we had our original participants, and we call them mothers. 90-some% were their mothers or other parents. And so it was easy. We'd talk about the girls and the mothers. Well, then we asked the mothers about their own upbringing, and so sometimes we talking about the mothers, and then eventually we got the offspring into the study, and so we talked about our girls as mothers, and we were really confused. So we labeled them. G0s are the grandparents of the original participant. You can see that. The most important, well, okay, it's clear. I'll remind you. Okay, here are some of the main effects. So when we first started at our time 1, so we brought them into our lab, tested and interviewed and weighed and measured and actually got blood originally for hormones, and almost everything we looked at, they were different. The abuse group, on average, was different from the parents. So they were higher in depression, anxiety, psychiatric diagnoses, acting out behaviors, lower in self-esteem, perceived competence, reported smaller and less satisfactory social networks, and had more classroom behavior problems and lower performance. And we used pretty much a multi-method approach whenever possible. So they were reported by the girls themselves, by their parent, by teachers. Okay, here's one example from an article that we put out. So the red line represents the average scores on a number of different dimensions for the abuse group, and the blue line, the comparison group. So you can see there's barely any overlap. The dimensions, which I don't know if you can read, I can almost read it on the monitor. Delinquency, immaturity, aggressiveness, depression, physical problems, child depression inventory, trait anxiety, low sense of competence, and dissociation. So, and the asterisk means significant differences. So it's just sort of an illustration. Now, here it is, time 4 or 5, essentially 7 years later, you can see, and this is a good sign. They're closer together, but still, the red line is still above the blue line, you know, pretty much constantly. And what we also found was that later on, once they were in adolescence and young adulthood, we were able to assess a lot of areas that were unaccessible when they were younger, and so we were finding different kinds of effects later. So the arrows indicate a significant difference, with the abuse group being higher, and with the arrows going up. So they were higher in what's called pathological dissociation, PTSD symptoms, depression. The number of rapes or sexual assaults that were reported later, twice as many. Domestic violence, almost twice as many. Self-harm or suicidality, 4 times as high. Higher also in other sort of accumulated lifetime traumas. Body mass index, so they're heavier. Their self-reports of their overall physical health was lower, and it included more reports of both gynecological or gastrointestinal problems in particular. They reported going to doctors more, having more hospitalizations, having more sleep problems, and sexual distortion. Which I'll also talk about a little more about that too. Okay, but one of the things that is quite important is that there was a lot of variability within the group, within the groups, but particularly the abuse group had more. And I meant to point that out to you on the first slide with the red line and the blue line, that those were standard error bars indicating variability, and they were always longer for the abuse group than the comparison group. And so we were interested in looking at what we could find out about that. So here's the slide I showed you before with mean and averages characteristics of the abuse experience that they had. I just put this up for a visual, Here, each horizontal line is one of the girls in our study, characterizes the sexual abuse of one of the girls in our study. So the left-hand side of the line is the age at which it began. So at the bottom, you probably can't read that. It goes from essentially birth to age 16. So at the left-hand side is the age of onset of the abuse. The length of the line indicates the duration of the abuse. Red indicates penetration, blue indicates no penetration. And then they're organized by those 3 groups of perpetrators: biological father, other father figure, and at the bottom, other relative. If you can see the 2 vertical lines in the middle, that indicate, the one on the left indicates age of onset, the average age of onset, and the width between them is average duration. So this is just, to me, it sort of visualizes that our ways of summarizing data a lot in terms of averages do not do justice, if you will, to the quite wide variability within those that's not captured by central tendency measures. And the other thing that you can see here is that in general, the biological father characteristics look different from the other father figure in terms of there's much more longer lines and earlier thing. And so they were essentially, a lot of the upshot of this, a lot of the characteristics of this abuse is sort of correlated with other aspects. So it makes it, more complicated to consider. What we decided to do was a cluster analysis, which is you often use a preliminary statistical technique to sort of see if people group together on certain characteristics. And when we did this, we identified the certain characteristics of the abuse that into 3 clusters. One was that we labeled multiple perpetrator, not biological father, one single perpetrator, not biological father, and the third was biological father, which in some cases there were multiple perpetrators there as well, which if we didn't have enough, a large enough sample. As I said, it's sort of a preliminary technique that helps you figure things out, but you need enough people, so your sample size kind of limits you to what you can do. And this just, the main point here that I want to show you is that age of onset was different for these different clusters, where the girls in the biological father cluster were abused. The abuse started a year or so younger on average and lasted quite a bit longer, close to 4 years. The other thing, or one other thing that was different is that down at the bottom on residing with the perpetrator, 95% of the biological father cluster group lived with their father, but 90% of the multiple perpetrator were living with that person at the time of the abuse. And so that's also, we think that's an important dimension in terms of, particularly if you think of the duration of the abuse and that you're living with that person and you're young. How's that? Put those all together. Okay. I'm sorry that this thing flips like that. Somebody made it for me. I don't know how to unmake it. So looking at these 3 clusters, the general finding at time 1 was that it was the girls in the biological father cluster who had the most problems and that were the most different from the comparison group, and that the single perpetrator, non-biological father, had the least problems. Okay, and then when we use these same clusters to organize the later, at the time 4 and 5, basically, what we find is something that still puzzles me a huge amount, and if somebody would like to work on this, I'd love to have them do it. The multiple perpetrator girls, cluster girls, in adolescence were not different from the comparison group on these same measures we looked at. The biological father cluster girls were still higher on these domains, and the single perpetrator girls were looking worse than they had before. So another way to look at it is sort of like this. So the comparison girls go up a little, as those of us who've had adolescence are not surprised in terms of behavior problems and mood and things. And then the biological father group stays the same. Well, you can see it. Okay. Moving right along here. Here's another area in which the differences among our essentially homogeneous sexual abuse group can be seen. So at our time 4 and 5, so when they were 18, on average, 18 to 20, we started asking them about their sexual activity and attitudes. So here are some of the findings then. They reported to us then their age at first intercourse, meaning not the abuse, but their first voluntary sexual intercourse. And the abused girls average 14 years of age, the comparison girls 15 and a half years of age. So a year and a half difference in terms of when they went into sexual relationships. We had this measure we made up called birth control efficacy, where we looked at what did they use birth control, how often did they use it, and what did they use. And the abused girls used less efficacious birth control. That question, of course, was only asked of the girls who said they were sexually active, or had been at least. And then they also were more likely, twice as likely to say they were trying to conceive than the comparison group. No difference in number of pregnancies or number of abortions, but that's a lot of abortions by, I think. This shows the number of teen pregnancies that, so the red line is teen pregnancies bar, and the green is whether they actually became a mother as teenagers. So you can see here, too, that there's a big difference in our sample for the abused girls as compared to the comparison girls. Okay. And then, as I mentioned to you, the measure we used also looked at sexual attitudes. We had a long questionnaire that we took from UDRI, whom some of you may have heard of, changed it, modified it a bit, where we asked questions about what they thought about sex, basically. And we factor analyzed that, and two of the factors that we came up with, one we labeled preoccupation, and preoccupation had items on it that both had to do with being involved in sexual activity a lot, thinking it's good, saying that things make them think of sex a lot, so that dancing makes me think of sex. A picture of a boy makes me think of, things like that. One of the other factors we called aversion. So these were items about, I wish sex didn't exist. Sex is bad for you. My parents would kill me if, so a lot of things about negative aspects of sex. We also, sort of because of a variety of things that had been in the literature, we developed an index called ambivalence. And this was actually just a sum of preoccupation with sex and aversion to sex. So there'd been some other studies, and there were some indication here that just because you were preoccupied with it didn't mean you thought it was good, in fact, to the contrary. So here I'm showing you, in purple is the comparison group. Oh, so then we took these scores, standardized them, put them all together, and standardized them in a way that a 0 would be the average score for the entire group of people. And then, so a positive score above 0 means they're higher than the average, and a negative score means they're lower than the average for the whole group. So the purple is the comparison group that shows they're kind of right average for preoccupation, close to average for aversion, a little bit low compared to everyone else for ambivalence. But so is the multiple perpetrator group. They're right there. Puzzles me. But here is the single perpetrator non-biological group. So they report a lot of preoccupation with sex and little aversion to it. And here is our biological father group. So they report the most aversion and some preoccupation, and so high ambivalence about it. And I think the couple of things that I think are important about this is that this is a sort, I call it a homogeneous group. I mean, it's all familial abuse, it's all contact, whatever. And yet there are different outcomes, not only on this, but this kind of symbolizes different outcomes for the sexual abuse depending on characteristics of the abuse, apparently. Okay, now briefly, hopefully, tell you about some of the, so at time 6, we saw the offspring of our girls, our G2 girls, and we had 135. They were median age about a little under 5, I think, and they were infants through, I think we had a 10-year-old, was the oldest. Okay. This is work that Jenny Knoll did as part of a K award that she got attached to this study. We had, the abuse group had twice as many preterm births as the comparison group, okay? And that cortisol levels and prenatal alcohol use were both predictors of that. Cognitive ability scores of our G3, so in IQ units, meaning in this case the average score was 100, and anything below 100 is below average. So the comparison group is a little below average. The abuse group is below that. These are only for this is not for the babies. It's only for the ones that were old enough to take this. Okay. Moving right along to intergenerational findings. So the G1 mothers, our original mothers, we found early on were much more likely to report that they themselves had been sexually abused than the comparison mothers. Almost half of them said they were. We asked the mothers a lot about their upbringing, including, not only this, but how they were reared by their families. And what this shows you is that we divided our abuse group mothers into two groups, the half that said they themselves were sexually abused and the half that said they weren't. And I'm never quite sure what that color is. It's sort of reddish brown. The reddish brown bars are the ones who said they had been abused themselves and their daughters had been abused. The gold had abused daughters, but they said they weren't abused. And the green is essentially the comparison group. And along the bottom, we asked them, embedded in a lot of other questions. You think you were emotionally abused by your mother? That was the first one. Physically abused by your mother, emotionally abused by your father, and physically abused by your father. And so what you can see here is differences in the among the mothers of abused girls, where those who'd been abused themselves were over half of them reported that they were emotionally abused by their own mother. So their upbringings were different, I guess. Okay. I could go into that longer, but I can't. So we also were wondering, so what difference does that make? Thanks, I gotta really speed up. In their parenting. And one of my students did her doctorate on this, where she looked at parenting attitudes, provision of positive structure and use of harsh punitive discipline, and her overall, this doesn't always work. Okay, overall model was that, so prior work had indicated there might be a connection between being sexually abused yourself and your attitudes as a mother, but also we're finding in our other studies have shown that having been abused yourself, physically abused, affects parenting, and we find that in our sample those tended to go together. So what she was looking at was is there a direct relationship between being sexually abused versus being physically abused, and might those be mediated by blah, blah, blah. Okay, to speed up here. The upshot is that for provision of positive structure by these mothers, that their having been sexually abused was not related when you were looking at it in a model with these other things. It was the having been harshly punished as a child. The mothers who were harshly punished as a child through the root of, in this case, of high dissociation, were providing less positive structure to their daughters. On the other hand, in terms of punitive discipline, the same effect was there for the mother's punitive upbringing, but there was a direct effect of experiencing sexual abuse and punitive discipline, but it was negative. So those mothers who had been sexually abused were less likely to provide, to at least say that this was self-report. Okay. And I just need a few more minutes, okay? Okay. The other thing we found at time 6 was that our G3 offspring were already more likely, the offspring of the abuse group was more likely to have already been reported to Child Protective Services, 17% versus 1%, and that most of this was for neglect. We had a couple of cases of physical abuse, one sexual abuse, which I believe was the same perpetrator as the mothers, and of these who were in protective services, 40% had been permanently removed from the home. And there were 3 deaths of offspring, and they were all deaths of abused mothers. 2 preemies and 1 drowned in the bathtub. Shown a different way, and also indicating that of the families that were in protective services, not only were they in the abuse group, they were likely teen mothers, which we all know that teen mothers, that's another risk factor, so they had the double. Okay, moving ahead very rapidly. We looked at cortisol over time, and so once we got through our time 6 in particular, we could do growth curve analyses from essentially age 6 to age 30, which was great. And so this is an article that came out a couple of years ago indicating that our cortisol, the stress hormone, was originally higher in the abused girls, and over time and over age becomes attenuated or lower than the comparison group. Attenuated cortisol, according to Susman, 2006, it's considered as possibly an adaptive response to the problems of it being too high most of the time, and that has both psychosocial and physical health and mental health potential consequences. This shouldn't be in health, but it's also in growth curve finding that we had that essentially, so the PPVTR is a receptive language vocabulary measure that's highly correlated with overall IQ. And the little black lines there actually are individual people. And you could see how you could build a growth curve through individual people, none of whom go quite that whole age range. So what this shows is that whether you're looking both at the linear or quadratic curves, while they start similarly among younger people, it diverges to the detriment of the abuse group over age. We also found that our girls were less likely to finish high school than the comparison group. And then obesity. What these show is that although our abused group girls are somewhat heavier on average when they're young, that the difference between them and the comparison group grows and is significant by young adulthood. And again, we could do a growth curve analysis of that. The black dotted lines are the 25th and 75th percentile according to CDC, and you can see the blue comparison group is kind of in the middle there, but the over age, our abuse group diverges again. Okay. I don't know that okay, just have two more, I think. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about treatment and policy issues. So our sample received very scant treatment, mental health treatment at the time. So remember, we're talking about the late 80s, early 90s. The empirically based treatments that we've heard alluded to basically didn't exist. And it was at the peak, actually, of protective services getting referrals. So they were overloaded. I think most of our girls got 3 or 4 sessions somewhere of some type. So that was bad for them, and it probably contributes to what we're seeing now still, which may be different from, as David Finkelhor mentioned, now that we know more, things may not be as bad and long-lasting. Symptoms that we saw were not always acutely present, but emerged later in development, so that treatment may need to be either continued or revisited, we think, particularly around particular developmental issues. But it also seemed to us that no single treatment can really address all of these different kinds of problems that we've come up with. Okay. The interventions that have been developed rarely address cognitive deficits, educational aspirations, early pregnancy, physical health. I think more and more we're beginning to pick up on that, so that tailored interventions seem likely. We've heard a lot about how people, and pediatricians, we would say in particular, need to be aware of these possibilities, as do, and I think more are, treatments for things like substance abuse are beginning to be tailored to abuse victims, which is good. Okay. So where are we going from here? Well, we have a lot of ongoing analyses still. We have a lot of stuff from our times 1 through 6 that we haven't yet mined very well, and particularly with understanding the different trajectories that our girls have taken and the intergenerational processes that are occurring. One of the things, we've talked earlier today about people who are abused becoming abusers. Well, in this area at least, our mothers are not the abusers. The mothers who were abused are not the abusers, but still the fact that there's so many more mothers, abused girls' mothers who've been abused themselves, it's a different kind of intergenerational transmission, I think, that we want to look at more. And similarly, the one finding we have so far is that the kids in protective services are there for neglect. So it's a broader kind of intergenerational transmission. Jenny, Noel, and I have an application pending. We're hoping to fund times 7 and 8 assessments. We've already contacted 85% of our sample and still looking for some, and they're ready to participate. We have 230 known offspring. So this study, we're particularly going to focus on physical health, as well as sort of following up on the mental health aspects we have before, but also our findings of cortisol differences, obesity differences, health utilization differences, and our our girls, that is the G2s, will be in their 30s by the time, assuming we can get this money. And then we also want to focus on the G3s and see how they're doing as well. So there's one journal article that came out about a year ago which summarizes a lot of this, and I'd be happy to get it to anyone who is interested. Okay.
Dr. Trickett, so in lay terms, if you had to say what are the top 3 findings that have emerged from your study about female victims of incest in terms of trauma impact, what would they be?
Well, one certainly is that I guess we need the whole adult approach. So if we talk about the whole child, we had a whole child perspective at looking at what the impact might be. In fact, the impact has been across many domains, and that not necessarily the ones we would have thought of to begin with, or particularly, say, PTSD. We have PTSD symptoms. We don't necessarily have a diagnosis. And I don't know that we would have predicted the cognitive problems, particularly the educational problems, but it's all a package, I guess, that's really important. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think results would be the same if you had studied boys? What differences would you expect? Would boys be more apt to act out with violent activities or delinquent acts?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't expect it to be the same. I don't know for sure how it would be different. I do think that, one of the things we've talked about is that girls are more likely to be abused by a family member and or a close family friend, I think. And so and given that in our study we find it's different if you're abused by your biological father versus a single perpetrator who's not a biological father, so that I think that both the nature of the abuse and the nature of boys and girls make it likely that there would be different things. Going to the other study that I'm doing in California, the boys there who've been sexually abused, who have also been, these come from protective services, so they're a little different, who have also mostly been neglected and physically abused, but they are the most depressed of any of our kids in that study. So I think we have this perspective that girls get depressed and boys act out that often doesn't hold up. And I know our girls here were acting out quite a bit in this study. So that gender difference, doesn't necessarily hold.
Okay, do we have one more? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one.
Okay.
Is it reasonable to talk about resilience in this population? And how would you conceptualize or define what that would be?
I wish I had more to say about that already, because one of the things that that we noticed so early on was this issue of variability in fact, I think, so Frank Putnam, those of you who know him, he studies dissociation as his great interest. And very early on, we just plotted dissociation scores of the two groups, and the means were different, but the variance was just huge in the sexually abused girls compared to the comparison girls. And we've never gotten a handle on whether that means some people get dissociate and others act out, or it's the same people who are not dissociating and not acting out and doing just fine, So that's really one of the things I'd really like to, do in the next few years, if I could just find the time. Thank you.
So I think it's time for a break? Okay, so it's time for another break. I would like to thank Dr. Trickett for being here, joining us. So we are reconvening at 3:15.